Have you got around $2,000 to spend on your next gaming PC? And if so, should you consider Intel's brand new Core Ultra lineup of CPUs for your next build? Well, in this video, I'm going to be finding out by assembling what I think could be the best $2,000 gaming PC build, a system that takes advantage of Intel's new, more efficient, albeit not that much more powerful platform, and a high-end GPU for awesome 1440p and even a bit of 4K gaming. I'll be walking you guys through all the parts that make this build possible, why I've chosen the ones that I have, as well as providing some alternative choices too, before looking at the all-important benchmarks later on to see how in a range of titles this build performs, so that before you assemble, you can be sure what you're getting yourself into. Let's do this. The Corsair Titan series is here. Corsair's latest lineup of 240mm, 280mm and 360mm of coolers feature Corsair's new flow drive cooling engine with a 3-phase pump for higher flow rates, higher efficiency and better cooling. Cap swap compatibility allows you to change the top plate of your cooler, while IQ Link support and magnetic dome RX fans round off a design that's ready to keep your CPU cool under pressure. Check out the range at the first link below. Let's start off with the CPU, shall we, and talk about Intel Core Ultra, because that is, well, at the moment, the big news. Now, Intel Core Ultra is Intel's new lineup of CPUs. They've gone for a different branding this time, but under ordinary circumstances, this would have been called Intel 15th Gen. There is no more i3, i5, i7, it's now Core Ultra 5, 7 and 9. I'm guessing we'll see some Core Ultra 3 chips land in the near future. Now, a lot's new with these CPUs. We're talking a new architecture, we're talking a new CPU socket, we're talking new core configurations, no more hyper-threading, more on that shortly, and much better power consumption over the 13th and 14th gen chips that the Core Ultra lineup looks to replace. Now, of course, Intel's previous gen CPUs have had some issues, and lots of people are kind of wondering whether they can trust what Intel are bringing to the table. Now, the first major step from Intel is getting power consumption under control. 13th and particularly 14th gen were ridiculous, and we were seeing hundreds and hundreds of watts out of chips that in previous gens would have consumed half of that. Now, this particular chip has only seen a drop down from last gen of around 25 to 30 watts under peak power, but that clocks it in at around 160 watts, which is a reasonable amount for a CPU of its prowess. Now, Intel has also got rid of hyper-threading. So previously, before P-cores and E-cores, you'd have for every core 2 threads, and that was basically a way of optimizing further performance out of each of the cores. When P-cores and E-cores came along, we saw hyper-threading amongst the P-cores, but no hyper-threading on the E, the efficiency cores. Those are the cores that are supposed to handle all the background tasks. Now, P-cores and E-cores are still present, it's the hyper-threading on these cores that, well, isn't. Now, you might think that means less performance. For multi-threaded applications, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. And you can read our review of the higher-end chips on our website now, or linked in the description below. However, for a gaming build like this one, the Core Ultra 5 with its 6 performance cores, that's the same as what you get on a Ryzen 5, plus the additional E-cores, makes this quite an interesting prospect, and something that for gaming should give us more than enough performance. Clock speeds are similar to last generation. We've only lost 100 megahertz here. Again, it would be nice to see this go higher, but the better power efficiency is more than likely going to lead itself to more stable and reliable overclocking. And again, I know this is all getting really quite complicated, but the likelihood is these chips will actually have a chance of hitting the turbo clock speeds. 14th gen, without really intense cooling, just would not get to the giddy high speeds that you expected based on the numbers that were published. So what does all this mean for actual raw performance? Well, before jumping into the detailed benchmarks of this exact configuration later in today's video, we have actually tested the Core Ultra 5 and by extension the Core Ultra 9 using our standardized testing methodology. This is what's going to give us the good comparable results, not only for this video, but for our reviews over on GeekaWhat.com as well. Now, the best place to start is single thread performance, because that's going to give us the clearest indication of all of the CPU's performance out the doors. Now, straight away, the Core Ultra 5 sort of sits in the middle of the road. It's not giving us any better single thread power than something like a mid-range AMD Ryzen 5, and it's certainly not knocking on the door of the last gen 14600K either. In fact, in this initial synthetic benchmark, we were fairly disappointed. The Core Ultra 9 does better, but again, hardly topping the chart. Move through to the multi-core test in Cinebench R23, and the numbers are better. The Core Ultra 5 actually outstrips the previous generation Core i5 14600K, and the Core Ultra 9 does top out against the i9, 13 and 14900K, which is better to see. Results then seem to be improving. gaming. Move through to 3D Mark's times by extreme, and this is a little bit more representative for gaming. The Core Ultra 5 again did better than the 14600K, by a slightly larger margin this time, while again the Core Ultra 9 did well. In 3D Mark's Firestrike, the physics score was again a little bit of a mixed bag. The Core Ultra 245K, that's the Core Ultra 5 chip, did better than the two previous Gen i5s, while the Core Ultra 9 actually did significantly worse. CPU profile positions both chips fairly well, especially when it comes to the max thread score, so again, slightly better for Intel here, but hardly anything that makes the old Gen chips look distinctly obsolete. While moving through into our normalized gaming numbers, so this was the Core Ultra 5 and Core Ultra 9, paired with a Radeon 6950 XT, just to give us that comparative data when we look at previous Gen CPU launches, and the Core Ultra 5 did better, outstripping the 13 and 14600K by a few frames per second, and the Ultra 9 topping the graph. Okay, things seemingly slightly better, but that's a pattern that doesn't necessarily improve much in Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered at 4K high, where the Core Ultra 5 performs basically identical to the 14600K, while the Core Ultra 9 actually performs worse than the 14900K that it should be improving upon. Battlefield 2042 is our final normalized gaming test. Apex Legends and Fortnite simply would not work. We think it's to do with the anti-cheat, more on that in a moment, where the Core Ultra 9 lagged behind the Core i9, and the Core Ultra 5, again the main focus for today's build, did better than its last generation counterparts. So from this, the Core Ultra 5 looks to be the slightly better buy, but the performance differential over the last and even the generation that came before it in 13th gen, just not particularly large across the board at all. The main improvement really comes in the form of power consumption. We actually recorded peak power consumption using a CPU-Z stress test, with the Core Ultra 5 only topping out at 117.3 watts peak power consumption. The Core Ultra 9, for reference, was about 219. This is a serious reduction over the 13th and especially the 14th gen, which is at least one positive to draw upon. So that's the CPU. What about the motherboard? Well, thus far, it's only really a widespread launch of Z890 that brands seem to be concerning themselves with. However, for the Core Ultra 5, and given that this particular board is a more entry-level option, I think this could be a really good fit. Now, one of the really cool things about this MSI Z890A board is that I actually saw this board being built at the MSI factory in China. That's right, MSI actually kindly invited me over to see the production process, and I have to say, it was a pretty special experience. But I do believe, that aside, this to be the best board for this build, and let me talk to you about why. First is aesthetics. The board has lots of silver and white accents, which are going to match really well with the case, and as you can see from behind me, it's a bit of a white theme today. You get cool quality of life features like this easy to remove toolless NVMe drive slot. As you can see, this just slots straight back on with no problems. You've also got a button now to release the PCI slot. Now, it's not actually a release, it's technically an on-off switch, so you should have this open, install the card and close it. Might be more confusing for the first time builder, but I really like it. Socket, of course, is the brand new Intel socket for Core Ultra, not backwards compatible. Memory DIMM slots, it's just standard DDR5, no DDR4 support this time around, although you do get support for the new QDIMM technology. Basically fancy RAM DIMMs with internal clock units and timers in that should help with higher speeds. And if we spin around to the rear I/O of the motherboard, you can see connectivity is better. Thunderbolt 4 here, so super quick, plenty of high speed USB Type A and Type Cs, 5GB Ethernet, optical audio and Wi-Fi 7. Considering this is one of MSI's more budget-friendly boards, it is really well equipped. So really great work on this one, MSI. Memory-wise, I've gone for a Corsair Vengeance RGB kit. This is just a 32GB DDR5 kit, so it should fit the bill very nicely. SSD-wise, I've gone for the Team Group MP44L. This is just a standard 1 or 2 terabyte Gen 4 drive. Now, it delivers really strong speeds. You can see our review and why we like this so much on the website in the cards now, if it takes your fancy. I do want to talk a little bit about cooling as well. Obviously, with the previous gen set of CPUs, you had to have quite high-end coolers. Here we shouldn't. So to really test that out, I'm going to run the Cooler Master Hyper 212 Halo White. Why? This is a $2,000 build, and I don't want to be wasting money spending $100 on an all-in-one, even a budget unit, if I don't need to. So let's see where we land with this a little bit later. While I'm talking about the parts, graphics-wise, I've gone for the 4070 Ti Super. Now, as far as higher-end graphics goes, yes, it might be worth waiting for NVIDIA to hold their press conference where we're widely expecting the 5090 and potentially 5082. Would I be surprised to see them replace the 4070 Ti Super? Yes. Will a new set of graphics cards potentially drop the price and cause flash and fire sales of the current gen? Potentially. So it might be that this is a build you want to do now, it might be that you want to wait, but the 20 Ti Super would be my bet. Of course, the alternative from AMD is the 7900 XT, but the added ray tracing and DLSS on this, for me, is what sets it apart. Now, for everyone, that isn't going to be the case. Some people are more concerned with things like straight rasterization. And if that's you, that's fine. But this is what I'd go for, and the Zotac Trinity OC Edition in white, I think looks amazing. Now, there is one more part I need to discuss and talk about in a bit more detail, and that is the case. Now, again, this is more of a modest build. It's an i5 system. It's not a no expense spared build, and that is where this comes in. The brand new Lian Li Langcool 207. Now, with this case, all is not necessarily what it seems. Now, yes, it's a fairly compact ATX chassis, so it does fit standard ATX motherboards. You've not got any room for eATX, but that's fine. There are two fans at the bottom of the case, which are going to provide direct GPU airflow, which is good, and a further 240 mils at the front. So two 140s and two 120s included as standard. There's no active exhaust, so it might be worth adding some exhaust fans in here, but we'll talk about that later. Now, you might be wondering, well, James, if these fans pull in here up to the GPU, that sounds good, but what about the power supply? Now, the power supply is actually offset and installs down here on the case, but in a different orientation, rotated 90 degrees over what you would usually see. You'll need to use a PSU extension cable, that comes included, which runs through to the port at the rear, and you'll need to be particularly mindful of power supply length. In fact, I haven't actually measured the power supply I'll be using, which I'm planning to be the MSI A750G out. It's one of the more compact units around, but I need to see, as of yet, whether it's actually going to fit. That's an interesting one for later in the build. In the meantime, maybe hold off buying anything from the links in the description below until you know it definitely fits. Otherwise, though, it's very, very Lian Li. You've got this nice top panel. I mean, the build quality on this is awesome. Very little flex. Rear panel is fully toolless, so that all just pops off. Even more mesh ventilation as well. We've got white rubber grommets, white cable pass-throughs. We've got white actual cables. The screws are silver. The attention to detail on this is phenomenal, and Lian Li deserve a lot of praise for what a great job with this case they have done. And I think that's pretty much all the parts that I need to talk about discussed. I have gone ahead and picked up some of Fantex D30 fans in white, which I may pop in. I don't want to spend too much money on this build, so it might be that we just add a couple in at the top and the rear. I want to see later how things stack up, but we're going to need definitely some active exhaust in the chassis, in my opinion. First things first is installing the Core Ultra CPU. In many ways, this feels like quite a big moment. Socket comes up, CPU goes in, give it a little wiggle. The first Core Ultra CPU install that I've ever done on the channel. I'm going to follow that up with memory, which is going to go in the 2nd and 4th slots in this build, followed by the SSD in the Lightning Gen 5 slot. Yes, it's only a Gen 4 drive, but it will benefit from the extra cooling, keeping the MP44L nice and chilly. Also going to go ahead and do a little bit of cooler prep at this stage. This Cooler Master 212 unit's fairly compact, so this should be pretty easy. The only thing that I must admit I haven't checked, but I think should be okay, is the whole backplate mounting situation. Obviously, this is a brand new socket. It's a slightly larger socket, so fingers crossed that isn't going to cause us any problems when it actually comes to installing this onto the back of the motherboard. That is just then going to slot through there. Yeah, it fits, baby. And I'm actually going to install the CPU cooler. With a water cooler, you'd only really get the prep done for the block. In this instance, I'm going to actually add on the metal brackets to the 212 and screw this onto the 4 pegs around the CPU. Bit of thermal paste to create that nice thermal bond, and the fan is going to go back on a little bit later. The board and the case are a match made in heaven, given it's an ATX chassis and an ATX motherboard, meaning it should just slide in without any problems. The motherboard tray in this case is quite tight. However, yes, that looks good. All the screws and stuff that you need to actually get the board installed come in this little handy accessory box, which you'll find underneath the GPU intake fans. Get these screws in, make sure you screw every corner down. Don't want to make any shortcuts at this stage, and that's going to then pave the way for the final stages of the build, and it's looking pretty good so far. I would really love to install the GPU next, but I know it's just not a sensible idea, and in fact the power supply is going to make a lot more sense at this stage, and it's finally time to figure out whether or not the power supply is actually going to fit. Now, this is quite a small unit. Ideally, I might have gone for 850, so I'll link the 7 and 850 units below. 750 should be good though. We're going to need a few different power cables, whether it be the CPU, the new GPU, the 16-pin connector, as well as connections for the motherboard and for any SATA devices such as RGB or fan controllers, that kind of thing. Now, I am going to pick up some white PSU cable extensions, again, very affordable, and I'll link these at the affiliate links in the description below. That's going to make this black power supply a very viable option without needing to spend a lot extra for one that comes out of the box with white or braided cables. Once those cables are in the power supply, it's moment of truth time. Will this actually fit? Oh, I'm quite nervous. Yes, it does. Now, there's not a great deal of cable management room to spare, and my only worry with this case would be if you then go ahead and stuff the excess cables down here a little carelessly, you're going to nullify the impact of the fans anyway. Screwing the power supply in from the front of the case and running the extension cable before jumping all of the power cables into the appropriate slots is a good shout. I'm actually still waiting on my extensions to arrive, so for now I'm going to add the standard black cables and swap those out for the white PSU extensions a little bit later. At this stage, I've also gone ahead and plugged in all of the front panel cables and connectors, including both the USBs, the JFP1 front panel, and of course HD audio. I'm going to resume the little cover down back into the bottom, which slides in without too much bother. That's going to tidy the whole build up a bit. It does strike me though, you can see that cable through the side, probably more so with our high power lighting than maybe you would otherwise. So we'll have to leave the verdict on that one until a little bit later. The remaining part really that's left is the graphics card. Now, I really like this Zotac gaming card. I think it's one of the best looking 4070 Ti Supers you can buy in white. And we're going to be using the second and third PCI retention slots to install the graphics card. Then make sure your PCI slot is unlocked, which ours is, before sliding the graphics card into place. Bit of pressure, and it's the same thumb screws that are actually going to secure the GPU down. Now, in terms of fans, I'm thinking that I'm going to pop a few extra ones in. Those Fantex white D30 fans aren't too expensive, so one at the rear, and then I think a further 3 at the top, just to take advantage of all this case's airflow potential, makes the most sense. So I'll do that, and then rejoin you for those all-important performance figures in just a few moments' time. Switch. So the build then looking pretty good, and I've got some thoughts about how the whole thing went. But first, let's look at performance, and specifically the performance of this exact build. We looked earlier at those normalized results with our standard test rig and a 6950 XT for better comparison. But what about the 4070 Ti Super and Core Ultra 5 combo? Well, let's start off, shall we, with Alan Wake 2 first of all. 4K high, DLSS set to quality, frame generation enabled, and ray tracing set to high and turned on. That was a mouthful. The build did well. 64 frames per second on average with ray tracing on high. Not really seeing a great CPU or GPU bottleneck here, a very good pairing. The Core Ultra 5 more than powerful enough for Alan Wake and the 4070 Ti Super in this build. Now for reference, if you do go ahead and you do turn ray tracing off, but keep your DLSS on quality, frame generation turned on, the frame rate does jump up to 92 frames per second. So if you're not bothered about that ray tracing goodness, you can get yourself a little bit more frame rate. Black Myth Wukong was next up on the benchmarking list. Here at 4K very high settings with DLSS again set to quality, frame gen turned on, and ray tracing this time set to medium. High was having a little bit too big of a frame rate impact for our liking, and here the build again did well over 80 frames per second with 81 FPS on average. I think the game looks really quite fantastic. 4K is obviously pushing the 70 Ti Super to its limits, but the card held up really well in my opinion. Moving through into Call of Duty's Modern Warfare 3 next up, again testing at the same 4K high settings with DLSS set to the quality mode. Here in Modern Warfare 3, frame rate was well over that 100 FPS mark with 139 frames per second on average, which was really good. Also tested out Warzone, just to give you a bit of an idea. Frame rates were very similar with basically identical settings. Frame rate dropped down slightly to 127 FPS on average, but this was still, in my view, pretty good. Cyberpunk was next up, and we tested 2 different settings variations again on this build to give you a bit of an idea. First was with ray tracing enabled and set to medium. That was at 4K, high settings with DLSS set to quality quality and frame gen turned on. Here the build achieved just over that magical 60 FPS mark on average across the run. 60 frames not really as high as what you'd like to see from a system like this. However, a lot of that I think is that resolution. We're just pushing slightly too far at 4K, dropped down to 1440p, and the build did better. High settings with DLSS on quality, frame gen on and ray tracing set to medium, 143 FPS, more than double as far as frame rate goes, which makes sense as obviously 4K is more than double the pixels of what you'll be rendering out at 1440p. Finally, before I dive into my conclusion and final thoughts on Intel's new CPUs, we also tested a little bit of Hogwarts Legacy, 4K high, and the build did well, 78 frames per second on average. Not much more to report than that, just 4K high settings, nothing too fancy going on, and the experience was really good. So, what do I think of this build? Should you go Core Ultra? What's going on? The main positives have to be in terms of power consumption, and then by virtue of that, temperatures. Power consumption on these chips is well down over the 13th, but especially the 14th gen lineup of processors, and as a knock-on effect, heat is a much smaller problem. In fact, it's not really a problem at all. This is a build with a Core Ultra 5 and a 212 cooler. It's a basic single tower air cooler that would have had problems with a 146 or especially 14700K. Yet here, when testing the Core Ultra 5, we had no issues. But I can't help but feel like this is kind of the CPU architecture that we should have had a year ago when 14th gen landed. An architecture that delivers very slightly more performance, but gets a lid on temperatures, works on power efficiency, because at the end of the day, none of us want chips to be getting less and less efficient and consuming more and more power, because that sets us on a trajectory that none of us want to end up on. However, for gaming performance and for what you're going to see on the screen, there's really not a great deal of difference. Yes, the motherboards are more up to date. 13th and 14th gen boards were a little by the by in terms of certain features, especially widespread PCI Generation 5 support. But other than that, there's not a whole lot that's changed, which makes this sort of a slightly tricky CPU lineup to recommend. Now, would I get this over 14th gen any day of the week? But I can't help but feel like Intel has sort of left the door open for AMD to come storming through and let AMD off the hook, who themselves released a Ryzen 9000 lineup of CPUs that was just a little bit underwhelming. So yes, this is a really good $2,000 or so gaming PC build, but it's not a great deal better than what you could have built 12 or 18 months ago. The end. There's not much more to say than that.